In this video, I would like to share with you a little bit about the EQ activity deck. Grant and I created this set as a facilitator's aid just to help you in terms of running an EQ training program, or even if you are doing some coaching to help your coachee along instead of having to carry the full workbook with you or to bring your laptop with your PowerPoint slides. So in this activity deck, we've got 4 main decks. The first one is, of course, a little bit of information about the EQ competencies based on our EQ competency framework, where of course you know there are 9 competencies. Now on the back of the card that looks like this, there are instructions, but I'll go through some of them with you all just to share with you how we use them. The next one, of course, is the zone of influence, or it's also known as the circle of influence in the notes that we do. We sometimes use this under the topic of connection. Then, of course, we've got the choice reaction cycle, and it gives you the instructions for how to do an activity using the choice reaction cycle. Usually, we would use it under the topic of emotional management. And the last one, of course, is the activity deck for dilemmas. It's really about how to become more responsible or more accountable for their behaviors. So we've come up with some case studies in case you have a class where they don't really have ideas of what kind of problems they may be needing to deal with. All right, so we can go through each of them in a little bit more detail. So the first one, of course, is the competencies. Now, in the competency cards, we would actually put their definition activity, the name of the competency. So you'll get 9 competencies and you have 2 sets of them. You've got the model there for you to refer to. Now, on the other side of the card, we have the definition. So, for example, here it's connection, and you've got the definition about building deep and strong relationships with others, etc. And then we've got some of the positive behaviors. Now, again, I find that sometimes we use this in the start of the class after the colorblind game just to introduce the different competencies, or you could actually use it at the end of a 2-day program or a 1-day program, depending if you're going to cover all 9, just to get people familiar with all 9 competencies. So you could use this as a summary exercise also, just to look at what are the positive behaviors or what are the expected behaviors of somebody who demonstrates connection, or somebody who demonstrates emotional management, and you have the 5 different behaviors here. All right, so again, you're going to have all 9 competencies and you have 2 sets. Now, we've given a suggestion here where you could partner up the people and ask them to share a story of a person that demonstrates this competency, either well or poorly, and then be prepared to share it with the class. Now, the problem is this can take quite a lot of time. So if you're doing a short session where you actually have time and you're just focusing on the 9 competencies, then of course, you can just use this as an activity and give this to them as pre-work so that they can go and do some research and think about somebody who demonstrates it well or poorly. Now, of course, if you don't have time, it might be good for you to also have in your mind different people that you could share and very quick short stories about these people of how they demonstrate the competency well or poorly. Of course, the other choice is to get the participants to give their own personal experience, especially when you're looking at a program with leaders. Now, again, if you're covering all 9 competencies for the definition activity, so put aside maybe about half an hour to 45 minutes. Again, sometimes for myself, other than using the advice cards, I like to use this at the end. So I put about half an hour to this and half an hour to the advice cards, so that in that last 1 hour, it is really a summary of all the 9 competencies, as well as different action steps that they can take if they want to improve that competency. Now, that's in training. When it comes to coaching, you could do something similar, where if you have a coachee who says, yes, emotional management is my lowest competency, it's on poorly skilled or moderately skilled, it's the lowest competency, and I want to work on it. So you could ask them to look at these 5 statements and say, is there any one of these statements that you feel speaks to you? So for example, they say, yeah, I'm not really good at looking at all situations in a calm manner. I definitely don't demonstrate this. All right, then we can have a deeper conversation. Now, if you're coaching the person over a longer period of time, you could go through each of them, and that could be really part of the coaching exercise that you can do. Now, of course, details to how to do coaching, we are covering in the debriefing of the EQCP, as well as in the module that talks about coaching. Another activity that we want to then look at is the choice reaction cycle. You must be familiar with the choice reaction cycle already. And of course, it's important for you to be able to give examples of the negative behaviors on the outside or some of the positive behaviors that either you yourself have done or an example of somebody who's been able to do that. Now, for this activity, again, the best learning that the participants will get is for them to break up into groups and then share with one another or even in pairs. So they could take a card, and if I'm not wrong, there's 10 of these cards with this is the front and this is the back. Ask one of them to share a situation that didn't turn out so well, and then ask the other person to ask them these questions. How did you react? How did you manipulate? How did you aggravate? All right, in terms of the trigger, interpretation, or intention. And then in terms of now trying to move it into positive behaviors, how could I respond? How could I reframe? Or how I could de-escalate? So they could actually start with triggers and start from the top, go down to the bottom, then move into the next part of the cycle, which is on interpretation, start with the top negative, and then move on to the positive ways, or for the next time when this happens to them. Similarly, they can look at the intention as we move along in the cycle, the negative behaviors, and then the positive behaviors of what they would like to have in the future. So that could take about 20 minutes as an activity. If you choose to turn it around and get the other person to do it, it could take a little bit longer. Again, so it depends on what your class is like. Now, again, in coaching, you could do the same thing with the person, especially if they're working on an issue that seems to be reoccurring, or if that coachee finds that it's very difficult for them to let go of this situation. So again, you could go through this with them. Now, the next one, of course, is we have the circle of influence, which we also call the zone of influence, depending on the name that Grant and I decided to use during the session or whatever comes to our mind. All right, so again, you will see this circle, and you have a choice of set A or set B. If you have time, you might want to do both, but if you want to just do one of them, then you could consider, like if it's more corporate, you might want to use set A because you can see it's about customer, it's about colleagues' performance, it's about your roles and tasks, your relationship with your boss, right, as well as working with departments. But if it's on a more personal level, for example, sometimes if you're dealing with frontliners or even with students and they haven't started working yet, or they're not even done their internships, you might want to do something a little bit more personal. So we're looking at things like health and well-being, family members, relationships with them, things that are going on in their own home, like politics and leadership in their country, or if you're looking at things that are affecting them in terms of their jobs. So if it is in a group, you can cordon off 3 areas in the classroom where you could have an area of, one could be control, one could be influence, and another one could be no control, no influence. Or of course, you could mark out a circle in the room using a string or even using a map. You can cordon off these 3 areas. Now, what you then do is you read out one of the statements. For example, we start with statement 1 on set A. Do you have authority, influence, or no control? Right? Similar words. Do you have control, influence, or no control? And then ask the participants based on this negative feedback given to you by a customer. If you feel you have control over it, stand in one section. If you feel you can influence it, stand in one section. If you feel you have no control over it, stand in another section. But again, remember, there's no right or wrong answer. After the person has stood in a specific area, you can ask 1 or 2 of them to share why they've chosen to stand there, and understand why they feel they have control, influence, or no control. Now, in a class, as a trainer, you don't really have to say much. You can just ask them questions. But what you want to do is to allow the other participants to hear the perspectives of the others. And then when you go into the next statement, it may then influence the way the others start to think. Now, of course, if you've got 1 or 2 participants who choose to stay under the area of no control alone, then you might want to really dig a little bit deeper and find out what's going on. Now, similarly, if you're coaching someone, you can do the same thing. You don't have to get them to stand in different places, but just ask them, to share with you. So again, you have 2 different sets here that you can use, right? If you can go through all of them, that would help. Again, this activity could take about 20 minutes to half an hour. Now, the next one, of course, is the scenarios or the case studies. As you can see, we've given 6 different scenarios, and we have about 4 or 5 cards for each of the scenarios. At this point, I can't really remember. All right, and you can use this after introducing conflict resolution, giving them the different steps from the time of the conflict, which is the case study? Are they able to apply any of the steps along the way in order to get to a resolution? Now, on the other hand, even if you're looking at a topic like empathy and you want to get them to share how they can deal with difficult situations, you can ask them to then think about what is the accountable or responsible thing to do. This could also come under the topic of consciousness, right, to make them more self-aware of how their behaviors have been. Again, so ladies and gentlemen, no right or wrong answers. Listen to what the participants have to share, or the individuals, what they have to share. Give them some time to discuss it as a group, or as to what kind of steps they want to take. They can actually end up presenting it either in a role play or just giving the steps based on the conflict resolution steps. Totally up to you as a trainer, right? I do find sometimes role play can be a little bit more fun, as it instills, it puts in a little bit of energy to the class, especially if you've got a group of people who like joking and fooling around with it. But again, don't be too critical about the way they respond. Sometimes you just want to open the group up and have a discussion to find out, is there any of these areas that they would do differently, or do they agree, or do they disagree? So make it a little bit more open in terms of the discussion, right? Again, this activity can take quite long. If you use all 6 scenarios and you give them about 15 minutes as a group to discuss, you give them about 5 minutes to present. In total, it could take about half an hour to 45 minutes. Again, looking at the different scenarios, you might want to look at the group, and there might be 1 or 2 scenarios that you feel may not be applicable for their industry. So you might, if you only have got 4 groups, then just use 4 different scenarios. Now, another way, of course, is if you don't want to do role play and you have enough time, you could just get them to discuss it, and then after 10 or 15 minutes, rotate it, right? That means now the group that was doing scenario 1, they will now pass their scenario over to another group, and they'll take on scenario 2. And those who were doing scenario 2 can pass it on to another group, and they'll take on scenario 3, etc. So, you can do that by rotating the different scenarios. Therefore, each group gets to try it out, find out what the scenario is, come up with solutions, discuss among themselves. But again, it takes time, so there may not be any presentation. Now, again, for you as the trainer, it might be good for you to walk around, listen to what the other groups are saying, and then find out from them whether or not this is appropriate, or you could get your advice or your add-ons, right? But again, remember, don't be too critical about the way they come up with their responses, unless you find that this is something that is really not acceptable and it totally doesn't sound EQ-ish at all. So this is another way that you could run the scenarios. All right, so once again, ladies and gentlemen, remember, if there's any issues that you are not so sure about, please contact Granville or myself to find out more about how to use these cards. So I really hope that this video has helped you, and enjoy using them.